Hey YouTube, Joe Edelmann here again. First off, I want to say thank you to all of you who have subscribed recently and brought this channel over 5,000 subscribers. Obviously, if you can't tell already, I love doing this, regardless of the size of the audience, but your support really does mean a lot to me, and I've had so many great conversations with all of you. I also want to take this opportunity to thank my two really close friends and collaborators in this space, Taka and Lucas. They've really been inspirational to me and supportive of me throughout this entire journey, so you should also check out their channels if you haven't already. I plan to hopefully keep growing and keep sharing my love of these bands and these sounds and some of my own work with you all whenever possible. I'm here today with a much requested follow-up to my Synth Sounds of Radiohead tutorial video that I made a while back. In that video, I gave a brief overview of some fundamental synthesizer concepts, and I walked through my recreations of 5 different polyphonic synthesizer sounds from Radiohead's recent discography. The link to that video is in the description, so you should definitely check it out if you haven't already. In this video, I'll take a step a little bit further back in Radiohead's catalog and demonstrate my recreations of a few additional sounds. Once again, I'm going to be using my trusty Dave Smith Instruments Prophet Rev 2 synthesizer to help me recreate these sounds. However, unlike in the first video, a couple of these sounds were not made using a Prophet synthesizer to begin with. As always, David at thekingofgear.com has a bunch of great articles detailing exactly what they were made with, but for now, hopefully my versions will help provide a good starting point for you to bring to your synthesizer or soft synth of choice. I will walk through the main settings of each sound and provide a full list of the parameters in the description. So the first sound that I'm going to walk through is Everything in Its Right Place. And specifically, I'm going to show you how to recreate the patch from the most recent live versions of the song where Tom uses his Prophet 08 synthesizer. And that's the version that I chose to cover most recently. As some of you might already know, the original recorded version of the song off of Kid A used a vintage Prophet 5 synthesizer by Sequential Circuits, which was Dave Smith's original company. There's a couple of key differences between that original recorded tone and the live tone that I'm about to show you, the first of which is in the filter cutoff setting. On the recorded version of the song, the filter cutoff point is set a lot lower, which gives the sound a darker, more mellow, and almost Rhodes piano-like quality, which in fact a lot of folks did mistake it for a Rhodes piano, since that's what Tom chose to use to perform it live early on. In the modern live version of the sound, the filter cutoff point is set a lot higher to begin with, which reveals more of that bright, fuzzy synth-type character to the sound. And it's being applied a very slow-moving LFO over time to modulate that cutoff point, which causes the sound to kind of open and close or become brighter and darker in periodic blooms over time, which is a pretty cool, effect mixed in with the rest of the band. The other key difference is that the modern sound has a healthy amount of pitch modulation applied to it by a second LFO, and that gives it that sort of seasick, warbly, almost Boards of Canada-esque character that's become such a hallmark of Radiohead and Thom Yorke's modern synth aesthetic. So I'm going to walk you through my key settings for this sound. Interestingly, this really rich sound is created using only one of the Prophet's 2 oscillators. And as I hinted before, I'm using the filter in its 4-pole mode, which is a less severe roll-off of high frequencies than the 8-pole mode. Setting the filter envelope amount to 30 is going to increase the influence that it has over the sound, keeping it brighter for longer with its release times. You may have also noticed that I increased the keyboard amount for the filter, which means that lower notes will have a slightly darker sound, and notes higher up on the keyboard will get progressively brighter. Increasing the pan spread causes successive notes to alternate in the left-right stereo channels, which just makes the sound wider. I'm setting the amplitude envelope pretty much in line with the filter envelope, with minimal attack and no sustain and moderately long decay and release times. And here is where we use the first LFO to give us that Boards of Canada pitch modulation. I'm also teeing up a second LFO to be used later in conjunction with the mod wheel, and this is the one that moves really slowly to modulate the cutoff frequency back and forth over time. I'm also going to take advantage of the Rev 2's onboard effects to add a tiny bit of chorus to the sound to just give it a little bit more depth and complexity for the single wave. Here's where I patch in the mod wheel to control the intensity of that second slow-moving LFO that controls the filter cutoff. I'm going to use a second modulation slot to have the first LFO, the one that's modulating pitch, also influence the cutoff frequency a little bit. Finally, I'm going to use a third modulation slot to patch a white noise source to the frequency control for the oscillator, which gives the sound a slightly harder edge. The next two sounds share something in common in that they were both originally created using Johnny Greenwood's Crumar Multiman or Crumar Orchestrator, which is a vintage string synthesizer. And what I found extremely interesting to learn after reading one of the King of Gear's excellent articles is that string synthesizers operate on a principle entirely different from a traditional subtractive polysynth. Whereas on a subtractive polysynth, you have a set limit of voices, such as, 5 in the case of the original Prophet 5, or 16 in the case of this Prophet Rev 2, which is essentially a limit on the number of notes of polyphony you can have. A string synthesizer works differently in that it has a single master oscillator running at a high frequency that then gets divided across the entire range of the keyboard so that it's fully polyphonic, similar to a piano. You could theoretically press all the notes at once. And these string synthesizers also had a variety of built-in effects on board, like chorus and vibrato and other modulation that could give them that kind of rich and dreamy type sound, even if they didn't sound that much like strings. That being said, I think I was able to get fairly close using the Prophet, but you be the judge. For Myxomatosis, there are two synth sounds going on in live performances of the song, one in each of Johnny Greenwood's hands. In the right hand, he's mirroring the song's growling bass line using originally a MIDI controller to trigger a sampled sound, and on more recent live performances using the band's Mini Moog synthesizer. And in the left hand, he's creating a pad sound in the kind of interludes of the song, originally done using the Crumar, but occasionally and on more recent live performances using Tom's Prophet 08. The pad sound is fairly direct and bright, just a little bit of modulation, and I'll show you my settings now. The first waveform I'll use for the sound is a sawtooth triangle combo wave, which I'll tune up to C3 to help with the performance range on the keyboard, and I'll modify the shape a little bit to get a fuller sound. For the second waveform, I'll use a pulse wave, also tuned up to C3 to match the other oscillator, and also with a bit of wave shaping. Then I'll detune the second oscillator slightly and mix the two together. The filter cutoff for the sound is set fairly high and bright, with a little bit of resonance and no influence from the filter envelope control. The amplitude envelope is set for a fairly immediate hold and press type playing style with a moderate attack, full sustain, and short release. As with the everything in its right place sound, I'm going to use the first LFO assigned to the pitch to create a vibrato effect. I'll use the second LFO assigned to the shape of the first oscillator to create a rhythmic thinning and thickening of the sound, sort of like a flanger. Finally, I'll once again take advantage of the onboard effects to add some chorus to the sound and make it a little bit wider and deeper. In the basement performance of the song Go Slowly, Colin Greenwood plays samples of the song's spacey synth pad that was originally generated using the Crumar on a MIDI controller. And the sound has a sort of quivering, pulsing, gentle quality to it that I've recreated on the Prophet using an LFO that's applied to the pulse width of the waves. I'll give you a rundown of more of my settings here. Similar to Myxomatosis, we're going to once again start with a combo saw triangle wave tuned to C3. And again, I'm going to tinker with the shape of the wave a little bit. This time, however, we're going to use yet another saw triangle wave as the second oscillator, also tuned to C3, and also with a bit of wave shaping. And then we just mix the two waves together. Also similar to Myxomatosis, a fairly high and bright cutoff setting with a little bit of resonance and no envelope control. And for the amplitude envelope, we're going to use a short attack and release time and a close to full sustain. And this last part is where that pulsating quality of the sound comes in, an LFO applied to the wave shape as opposed to the pitch. The next two sounds are also slightly different in that they are monophonic sounds as opposed to the more pad or piano-like polyphonic sounds that we've considered up until this point. In both cases, I'll be using the unison feature on the Prophet, which helps me replicate that more monophonic, one note at a time type behavior. They are both synth sounds or bass synth sounds from the album In Rainbows. And according to the King of Gear, the synth bass on the song All I Need was created using a Prophet 5, similar to the piano sound and everything in its right place. One of the characteristics of that sound is a slight ring modulation or frequency modulation type sound, which I've attempted to recreate here using the audio mod feature of the Prophet Rev 2's filter. I'll walk through some of the rest of my settings now. We're going to leave oscillator 1 in its default saw setting and bring in a second triangle oscillator an octave below. We'll turn on the hard sync to keep them phase locked and mix them together. Next, we'll bring in a healthy amount of the suboctave, which also helps overdrive the sound a little bit. And similarly, a tiny bit of noise. Next, we'll peel the filter cutoff way back. We're going to let the filter envelope do a lot of the work, similar to everything in its right place. We'll also add a slight amount of keyboard tracking. Next, we use the audio mod function of the filter, which works a lot like FM synthesis and gives the sound a little bit of a metallic edge. Next, we're setting up the filter envelope so that the cutoff point sweeps down from its highest to lowest point over a moderately long decay or release time. Next, we shape the amplitude envelope with a tiny bit of attack and a longish release time to follow the filter sweep. Finally, I'm going to once again use the Prophet Rev 2's onboard effects to add distortion and give the sound just a little bit more grit. So I don't know offhand what was used originally to create the what I call subwoofer through a second room type pulsing or throbbing attack of the bass sound in the song Videotape, but it appears as if, again, Colin is using a MIDI controller to trigger samples when performing the song live. One of the features that I attempted to replicate on this sound, I made use of the auxiliary envelope on the Prophet Rev 2 to put a slight attack on the pitch of each note at each key press so that the sound kind of bends down on each note and each press. Here's some of my other settings for the sound. So the first saw oscillator, we're going to bring down an octave and apply some wave shaping. And the second triangle oscillator, we're going to bring all the way down to the lowest octave setting and also shape the wave a bit. Similar to Myxomatosis, we'll detune the second wave to create a natural chorus, and we'll bring in a little bit of the sub-octave. Once again, we roll back the cutoff to darken the sound. In this case, we're going to use the envelope control in reverse, which means that decay will make the sound brighter over time instead of darker. And similar to All I Need, I'll use the audio mod to give a metallic quality to the sound. Here's where I'll put the slight bit of decay on the filter envelope, which is again moving in reverse to make the sound brighter. And here are the amplitude envelope settings, the most important of which is the release time, which is fairly long. And here is where I use the auxiliary envelope to create a slight pitch bend at the beginning of each note. I actually scaled back the settings from where I originally had them in the final version of the sound. Here's an example with a pretty extreme setting. And here is a much more subtle version. Finally, I wanted to share my approximate recreation of the synth sound from the song Daydreaming off the album A Moonshaped Pool. It's probably a safe bet that Radiohead used either the Prophet 5 or the Prophet 08 or even Tom's recent obsession, the Prophet 6, which is basically just a modern version of the 5, to create the sound. And in recent live performances, Phil Selway has been using Tom's Prophet 08 to kind of play along with this part from the song. It has sort of a gentle, again, a little bit of that warbly quality from the pitch LFO, sort of a mellower feel from the use of triangle waves, and sort of a moderate decay, not too long of a release time, but just enough to kind of blend in and layer alongside the piano arpeggios that take place throughout the course of the song. Here's a walkthrough of my settings. So I started this sound with a saw triangle wave that I played with the shape of until I could hear a nice high upper octave harmonic resonance, and then I blended that with a triangle wave that I actually set an octave above the bass tone. Next, I roll back the filter cutoff and tee up the filter envelope, which I'll later control with the mod wheel. Similar to everything in its right place, my filter envelope has a long decay and release time to mimic that slow evolution of the brightness of the sound, almost like a piano. I'm going to once again give the sound some panning, and I'm going to set up the amplitude envelope similar to the filter envelope. And now what's missing? You might have guessed it, an LFO applied to the pitch. With the first modulation slot, I'm going to let the mod wheel control the range of the low-pass filter envelope, which is just another way of brightening the sound with the mod wheel increased. And with the second modulation slot, I'm also going to tie the mod wheel to the release times of the envelopes, which has the effect of the sounds not only getting brighter as the mod wheel is pushed up, but also lasting longer. That's going to do it for me here. I'm hoping to make this a continuing or an ongoing series where I can cover, some of the synth sounds either from other artists or from some related acts like Atoms for Peace or for Tom York's solo discography. So stay tuned for that. But for now, be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time.